Well, I really had to kind of focus on it because growing up in the 80s, when I really first started discovering the meters, and I'd heard the meters and Dr. John and Professor Longhair and the Neville Brothers and all these New Orleans icons growing up. But when I first started really trying to apply myself to learn that stuff at the age of 17, 18 years old, most of what was on the radio at that time was all, a lot of it was quantized, computerized. There was the Police, and there were, some bands that had some really interesting, compelling drumming, but you did get a lot of quantized, computerized stuff on the radio. So I really did have to kind of come up with ways of developing it myself, which was helpful because once I started getting asked to write columns on a regular basis for Drum magazine, I didn't really know how to start synthesizing all these things that I had worked on into a program to help people develop the New Orleans stuff on their own. But because it was once a month and I started doing this, it really helped me gradually develop this program that once I was brought to the attention of a publisher, they said, well, you just flesh these out and you've got chapter outlines and you can turn this into a book. So that's really kind of how I started developing my ideas for the first book that became Take It to the Street. So I did have to work on it and develop it for myself, and that became very helpful in being able to demonstrate it to other people and help them develop it.
Yeah.
The notes, people can play the notes, but it's the phrasing, it's the inflection. It's almost like a musical accent. It's, of course we're speaking English, but then, you get in a cab with a guy from Boston, and it's like, oh yeah, there's that accent. But if I try to speak like a guy from Boston, we've all heard actors do it. Some can do it really well, some not so much. So, there are a few movies that have been ruined by accents. I'm not gonna go and name any, but but it's not easy to do. And so with the New Orleans drumming, with several other styles of drumming, you've got to learn that vernacular, you've got to learn the inflection, you've got to learn the phrasing, you've got to learn that musical, for lack of a better explanation, that musical accent if you're going to tackle a new style of drumming. So being born and raised, in the New Orleans area, I was able to grow up with it, but I still had to focus on it because you get in bands, and unless you're like, I'm going to play New Orleans stuff, a lot of bands, they want to play rock or what's on the radio, or, so you really still have to kind of focus on it. Yeah, I started off coming up with individual things to work on, basically chapter outlines, basically, very focused subject matter. And then once I started fleshing it out into the book, I realized that I had developed several things to work on this that I don't think people had really showed before. Certain exercises to work on actually developing the feel of in between straight and swing, and really coming up with ways to get in that in between the cracks phrasing that you have to really listen to a lot of that and really submerge yourself into it. You either need to be born in that culture or submerge yourself into that culture. And for me, even being born in Metairie, which is a suburb of New Orleans, but then going to Brother Martin, which was in Orleans Parish and all this, even being so close to it, I needed to really come up with my own way of developing all this stuff, which was helpful because it taught me how to become very good at explaining things. So it started with the New Orleans stuff, then I wrote Groove Alchemy, which is my second book, and now I'm working on a rudimental approach, my approach to splitting up rudiments around the kit, and so it's through that process of developing a way to develop the New Orleans stuff for myself, it's taught me how to develop being able to explain other topics to people. So now moving on to the funk stuff and then the rudimental stuff, and then have a couple other ideas to write. So I've got a few books up here that I'm trying to get out. Hey, I'm Stanton Moore, and for more videos, go to jazztimes.com.